May I ask Professor Das to commence the discussions?
I don't know, it's very difficult to talk on a book which you were not supposed to sort of discuss. I was supposed to moderate the session actually. So there has been certain change of roles, and the change of roles seems to have taken a toll on me. But I will sort of try and offer a couple of comments. I think that whatever research has already been conducted on urban politics in India actually follows either of the two trajectories. And there is hardly any overlap between these two trajectories. On the one hand, you have the trajectory which I would describe as a formal legal kind of trajectory, where emphasis is laid on the rules, institutions, and protocols of urban governance, the experiments which have been taking place since independence, or even before that, and the processes which are associated with these legal formal institutional framework, like elite formation, like, for example, how the urban elite is tied up with the rural hinterland, and how, for example, the urban elite is also tied up with the national political processes, and if necessary, they're also linked up with the global political processes, political and economic processes. So this is one kind of trajectory. And you know that most of the universities offer courses on a variation of theme of urban legal institutional trajectory. But on the other hand, you know that there have been some critical studies as well on urban politics. And I would say that these have been, to my mind, basically sporadic by nature, in the sense that they have been good case studies of urban demography, how, for example, sudden rush of population has taken place, settlement practices, displacement and dispossession. I am aware of CRG's own work, earlier works on displacement and dispossession and all those things. But I think that this book makes a departure in the sense that it's neither. It is not a study of formal institutional legal processes, because in one sense, yes, but it likes to see it as part of governing capital, governing the processes of accumulation. So it links the formal legal institutional processes with the articulation of capital, or even disarticulation of capital, which I think is an interesting landmark. I haven't come across any study in this vein. And it also, it doesn't follow the second trajectory, but it actually tries to link up the processes of displacement, dispossession with the larger story of capital accumulation. I think that in that way it marks a departure, and it's a landmark book. And although it's not the protocol, but I would not be doing my duty if I do not congratulate the authors on such a wonderful intervention and timely intervention. All the three authors deserve some kind of applause. So in that sense, it's a great departure. I would assume that at least some of you may not have read the book. And I would refer to 3-4 themes, and you can say that I have arbitrarily culled out those 3-4 themes around which the book revolves. And these themes do not necessarily figure in the chapters, but they come off and on. You can say that these are the running themes which sort of sutured the discussion which figures in the book. The first is that the whole idea of the establishment of new town implies the destruction of Rajarhat. Its economy, its politics, destruction is the word which is used. Rajarhat was the supply line. It used to supply fish and vegetables to Kolkata markets. And most importantly, it was the producer of public good, quote unquote public good, because you know that there was some sort of subsistence economy which was prevalent before Rajarhat was destroyed. And public good in the sense that you know that it could keep people within its domain, so much so that there wouldn't be huge out-migration of the inhabitants of Rajarhat to Kolkata. So that way it could stop migration because it had a flourishing low growth equilibrium, that's how economists put it, kind of economy. Now the old Rajarhat, in government records, interestingly, Rajarhat is recorded as a land which was acquired. And government figures do not give you any estimate about the number of people who inhabit this land. It's very funny. You know that a land which, the myth it creates is that it's a land without being inhabited. The book tells you the story of how these people, if they exist at all, are decimated or are left without any livelihood. The unofficial figure is that there have been at least 131,000 people who have been displaced in Rajarhat as a result of the foundation of the new town. The usual story, inadequate compensation, only 17% of the project affected families received compensation even after 8 years of their displacement by HIDCO. And where have these people gone? They have been massacred, they have disappeared, quote unquote disappeared, without leaving any trace, and without any trace, meaning that it becomes very difficult in some instances, and the book does a dense ethnography of some of these cases. It's very difficult to establish that some of these people actually existed in the first place. It reminds me of what Hannah Arendt was talking about, the totalitarian regimes in Germany or in Bolshevik Russia, Stalinist Russia, to be precise, where people would where the terror or fear is so total that even the widows wouldn't acknowledge that they had ever married, and this is the reason why it's very difficult to establish that this was a place which used to be inhabited at one point of time. Some people have become domestic help, construction workers, vegetable vendor, rag picker. It's an interesting story of how the owner of a 12 bighas of land has turned into a rag picker. It's an interesting ethnography which was conducted there. They have become security guards, chowkidars, and so forth. And you have the burgeoning IT sector where which do not obviously provide jobs to cultivators and fishermen. Now it's interesting because you know that the World Bank, for example, has always been insisting that if people who are displaced can be employed in the industries which are newly set up, then obviously there is absolutely no problem. What is our problem if they can be rehabilitated? But the problem is that these people who are displaced cannot be rehabilitated because the nature of skill requirement or skill demand is such that they can never be rehabilitated. I have seen, for example, the certificate which was issued to the displaced persons in Singur, and the certificate, for example, says that we give you a training, these are trained people, but it doesn't give you the guarantee that they would secure jobs. I have seen the certificate in original. So this is the first theme. The second theme is primitive accumulation. Primitive accumulation is the mechanism through which new cities are established and reproduced. And old industrial towns are wiped out. It's an interesting story. Violence and coercion on the one hand, and co-option and distribution of the loot and plunder so that everyone becomes a stakeholder. So you know that it's some sort of a win-win situation, excepting the people who are displaced or who are dispossessed. This is, and I quote from the book a particular sentence. I quote, "As we study Rajarhat, we realize why we cannot remain content with the discourse of non-coercive mode of power," and obviously a reference to the theory of political society which is doing the rounds in recent years, because it's, you know that it's a seamless kind of story of democracy where everything gets co-opted and swallowed up within the construct called political society. And I keep on quoting, "and consequently neglect the sites of production and physicality of our existence." I know one of the authors is completely obsessed with this physicality or materiality of the things, and he has his book on materiality of politics. So you know that politics is physical, but he's not, and interestingly, this physicality is not the kind of body politics that we normally talk about. And the phrase which is used, and I liked it most, that there was ubiquitous violence, which completely wiped out a whole population in Rajarhat. The third theme is the story of struggles and resistance. It persistently maintains that labor is not integrated into capital. The story of labor will have to be narrated independently of the story of capital. It is linked up with the story of capital, but it's not completely subsumed under capital. It retains its oppositional character. It's a brave statement, I think, without necessarily becoming successful. The story of struggle doesn't have to be a story of success, but that there is no success doesn't mean that there was no struggle. Is an interesting point which was made in this point, and I would rather nudge the authors to follow this line, that why is it that struggles under conditions of globalization continue to interrupt capital, interrupt not in the Gidwani sense, but in a different sense, but without announcing itself or without registering its victory. So you know that these are quote unquote unsuccessful, albeit significant struggles, but it's very important for political strategists to find out how, for example, we can recalibrate or chisel our strategies accordingly so that these struggles can secure the media glare and can become part of our public agenda. It's a very important point, if not eventually successful. And then again, please allow me to quote, how much time do I have?
Another 5-6 minutes.
Okay. So, and I quote a particular sentence: "If labor were completely integrated in the capitalist production of a new town, we would not have witnessed the opposition whose history has been recorded in some detail in this book." So it's a discovery of a new archive. Now, I remember one of my colleagues, for example, also conducted a study on Rajarhat, and he came out with the conclusion that it's a success story, it's smooth as silk kind of operation, and it should be showcased as one of the achievements of the government, that there was acquisition without resistance. Labor, I quote, "labor remains inadequately integrated with capital, so much so that the organic composition of capital as far as Rajarhat New Town project is concerned remains unsatisfactory." I think that labor is not completely subsumed under capital, is something which not only makes a departure from the political society kind of argument, or for example, at one level, but it also marks a departure from Gidwani's argument that if capital gets interrupted, then obviously it also draws from other logics. I don't know how one logic can draw from other logics, because by definition logics are not supposed to be compatible. But Gidwani emphasizes the point that it's once again a seamless story of the victory of capital. Even if it is interrupted at different points of time, it draws from other logics. I'm sure Ritujyoti will reflect more on Vinay Gidwani, but you will have to excuse me because I didn't have much of time to do justice to Gidwani's work. Gidwani terms it as critical genealogy, but if it is a critical genealogy, it's a critical, self-critical genealogy of capital nevertheless. So I don't know what is that criticality in the book that actually compels us to think, to conceptualize capital independently of, to conceptualize labor independently of capital. I have just two comments to make, and these are not critical comments. I would rather say that these are the two comments. Since the book has raised our expectations, we would demand more from the book, and we would request that the three authors should put their heads together and can come up with another volume along these lines. My first point is that it tells us, if it tells us a story of capital, it also tells us once again that there are different kinds of capital, new capital. It makes a distinction between old capital and new capital. And it also talks about different components of capital. I will come to that point quickly. That at one level you have, for example, state capital, and state-making capital. Some of the estimates are quite revealing that land which was bought has been sold off by the government ranging from 20 times higher to 160 times higher than what they were paid for. So you know that state was behaving not like a capitalist, behaving a capitalist. This is state capital, accumulation by the state. The second is that state as the facilitator of capital, that where, for example, it invites, it makes room for financiers and the providers and owners of tradable services. There is hardly any industry. So how, for example, state infrastructure helps them in further accumulating capital. And the third component of the new capital, which is interesting, is pure violence. And the agents of violence. For example, you have cronies, you have gundas, mastans, you have ruffians, hoodlums. But once again, I would say that the impression, and I would be, and please correct me if I'm wrong, that the impression that the book gives is this, that these three are happily blended together. So it tells us a story of capital, which is, once again, I would say that this is a seamless story of capital, as if there is no hitch amongst these three components. I can concede that there may be non-antagonistic contradiction amongst these three components, but I can see that this book could have reflected more on, for example, internal contradictions of these different components of capital. Let me give you one or two examples. Now, for example, what happens when the capitalists refuse to invest for fear of syndicates? So it's an internal contradiction. And you know that today, for example, many of the industrialists, quote-unquote industrialists, refuse to invest in West Bengal, reportedly on the ground that they will have to pay hefty rent to these gundas and ruffians. And this is one of the reasons why, for example, capital is not coming to West Bengal in the way it was expected to come. I would just, so this point, that internal contradictions of capital within capital could have been sort of, is a story which could have been amplified further. My other point is that it says that new capital, for example, is one where capital gets accumulated without the mediation of commodity production. It actually says that MCM plus now turns into MM plus, money making more money. I would say that here the mediating factor is violence. So I would rather suggest this. I have a mortal fear for mathematics, but I would rather suggest that MVM, what about MVM? Money, violence, and then more money. So you know that violence actually is the value add to the money. And when we talk about syndicate as an industry, in fact we have to factor in violence, and violence as an investable substance that can contribute to the accumulation of capital. And I think that this could be, this line could have been, I mean, it talks about violence, but it could have reflected more on how, for example, violence becomes instrumental in the accumulation of capital in a direct way. My second set of comments has to do with the struggles and resistance that this book chronicles. I have already talked about it, but you know that why is it that these struggles and resistance in fact could not become successful? As one reads this book, it actually attributes it to two factors. One factor is that massive co-option. I read one provocatively written sentence from the book: bribe everyone, co-opt all, make all the stakeholders share in the loot and prosper process, and showcase a big dream while keeping the directly dispossessed out. So this was one mechanism. So if for example, everyone is a beneficiary excepting the displaced, then there is no problem. But the second factor, I think that, which is very important, is this, that there was hardly any political party which took up their cause and which could have represented the cause of capital. Which could have represented the cause of these struggles and resistance. I think here the point is not so much that political parties did not represent, but I think that it has to do with the way representation in a liberal polity is structured. And I would rather try to find out a structuralist explanation for that why is it that the displaced and the dispossessed and their cause is never represented by the political parties. And it has to do with the way, for example, the whole instrumentality of representation is conceptualized. If you read, I'm sure that all of us have read, for example, the classical theories of representation, and John Stuart Mill obviously comes to my mind. Mill, for example, argues, 2 minutes? John Stuart Mill, for instance, argues that representation is not simply representing representing those who have voted you to power, but representation, if I can remember correctly, and I couldn't find out the book. I had the hard copy as well as the soft copy of Mill's Representative Government, but in the hurry I couldn't track the book, but I'm just sort of talking from my memory. Representation, according to Mill, is a public obligation. And remember this word public. It means that it doesn't mean that those who voted to power will be represented, but the representatives have the obligation of representing the public or common good. That was what he was talking about. And when we talk about the cause of the displaced and the dispossessed, obviously this is never considered as the common good. So it's completely outside the definition of common good or public good. I would just mention one important point, maybe that I will not have time to sort of reflect on it, but one point which comes to my mind is this, that it says that these struggles and resistance represent, and I quote, a new form of politics. I have my doubts. I think that it's a politics which is still in search of a form. And I would say that this is some sort of formlessness which characterizes this politics. And you can say that in that sense it is a critique of the representational theory, the theory of representation, that it doesn't have a form, that it refuses to be cast into a form, and that these struggles and resistances cut across the known varieties of forms. And this is a point which could have been pursued further. Maybe that I could have elaborated on it, but I would stop here for the time being. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Das, for a very insightful discussion. Poorna Shaw has joined us. Welcome. So first, I guess we'll have you discuss the books, 15 minutes, and then we'll move over to Professor Shaw.
I will take, Liz, I think 5 minutes. Because my roping into this podium actually made me aware that I am a habitual singer and not a habitual academic. So with this qualification, I just proceed. And I start with one, it is mentioned in Vinay Gidwani somewhere, I remember, but I start with it because I think Hegel is in our intellectual unconscious all the time, among the Calcutta intellectuals more specifically. So Hegel once said that he has a point, and I think Gidwani mentioned this, thinking of a dialecticity that is non-dialectical in nature. Right? So in Vinay Gidwani, you get an idea of this. He has made 2 points. I just summarize these 2 points and then finish my job. One is that capital's power to circulate and create subjects functional for its own requirements is never complete. That means capital is one which is many. So this is one formulation that he makes. Seems a bit banal after a lot of second is that is, I think, that is where he has a major point, where he tries to bring Harvey limits of capital, limits to capital, right? Limits to capital with Dipesh Chakraborty's post-colonial theory in provincializing Europe and also rethinking working class history. And he seems to suggest that in order to liberate labor from the frame of capital, you need to distinguish between the politics of work and politics of labor. Once you do this distinction, then labor can have its own use value for itself. So it can have its autonomous history as well. So these are the 2 points that he made. I think Professor Shaw has read the book very well.
So good afternoon, everyone. Now I want to make clear that actually I've focused most of my attention on the book by Ishita De, Ranabi Shamadar and Shujit Kesen. That's the book on Rajarhat. So I think I'll skip commenting on the Vinay book because I just didn't get the time. But I'll devote all my energies to this Rajarhat book, which in a way is very pertinent to us since it's located so close to us. We pass it by so frequently. And it has been a mystery what was going on there. So let me just begin, and I've written a little bit, and I've not written everything, but my initial reaction to the book and what I feel the book is doing, I've written there, and hopefully other points will come out as the discussion proceeds. So I want to begin by saying that this book, Beyond Kolkata, Rajarhat and the Dystopia of Urban Imagination, is a very well-written book on a very important theme, the building of new towns in India. Its appearance is timely as the new government in its first budget presented in July 2014 has a proposal to fund the building of 100 smart cities which will serve as satellites to already existing large cities. In demolishing many myths, half-truths and deceptions about the new town of Rajarhat and the way that it is being built, the authors have provided valuable insights into the reality of town building in India in the post-liberalization era. Drawing on the work of both Foucault and Marx, the authors have used Rajarhat as a template to dig deeper into the contemporary growth process of post-colonial capitalism and its inherent need to dispossess and destroy other modes of production in order to accumulate and grow. The first 3 chapters of the book provide a detailed account of how this process of dispossession and destruction of a prevailing way of life occurred. On the basis of numerous government documents, including letters, office memos and reports, as well as court orders, newspaper reports and field visits, a detailed account of how the new town was conceptualized, its aims and purposes, and the process of land takeover are presented. Rajarhat, located in the northeastern periphery of Kolkata, was conceptualized to be primarily a residential urban center to relieve the population pressure of Kolkata. The West Bengal government's initial project of 1995 indicated that 2,750 hectares of land would be required. By 1999, land requirement had been increased to 3,779 hectares to make room for IT hubs, educational and cultural institutions, and more residential and commercial activities. The core of the book is the way land was acquired over this large area. It was acquired through a number of means which make for shocking reading. The government violated its own environmental rules and regulations to secure land of this size, getting environmental clearance in stages and covering up 33 water bodies. In the words of the authors, violence, deceit, doublespeak, administrative persuasion, and strong-arm techniques were all used to get people to give up their land. Compensation and rehabilitation of the affected population has been very poor. The rest of the book is focused on examining why the need for such large-scale acquisition, the violent way it was done, its impacts on those who lost their land and living environment on the one hand, and on the other, tracing the antecedents of this new kind of city that Rajarhat New Town purports to be, and how this kind of city is different from the old city. Placing Rajarhat in a global and national context, the authors show the imperatives behind the need to create such a town. One of these is to find a safe haven for new accumulation away from the old city with its stronger labor base, heterogeneous multitude, and physical problems. Rajarhat is going to be a new kind of city, which the authors call a logistical city, to cater to the seamless provision of goods and services for the functioning of the new capital and new labor that characterize the 21st century's new economy. Towards the end of the book, the authors highlight the importance of the multitude, or ordinary people who, as net losers of this particular kind of urban change, rose up against the prevailing administration and its private backers to put a stop to the open land grab that was happening. But although local farmers were losing land, had resisted the process in various ways and endured much violence, nothing happened in their favor until after May 2011, with the official end of left front rule. Local resistance remained ineffective for more than 15 years and became a political issue only after the land resistance of Shingur and Nandigram. Was all the injustice, violence, and corruption that lay behind the dispossession of land from the local population worth the outcome? The authors compel us to examine this question. It is a question that is now at the heart of much of the debate on India's development and how it is to occur. The book, through the example of Rajarhat, thus draws us into the thick of some of the most critical and intractable issues confronting policymakers. It should be read carefully by those planning new cities and attempting to implement them on the ground as a pointer to what not to do. The book draws us to another set of questions, namely, can the process of new town building be different? And can the kind of town that is being built be different? Has new town building been more equitable and less violent in any other part of the country or during any other time period in post-independent India? These are also important questions, and they touch on another debatable point about present urbanization policy, which is whether we think we need new towns to start with, and if we do, are there more equitable and inclusive ways of going about building them? I'll conclude by pointing out that this book is one of the first that is about a new town project, both conceptualized and implemented in the post-liberalization era. It is a valuable contribution and should be read by all social scientists interested in urbanization and development issues in contemporary India. Okay, so.
Thank you, Professor Shah. I think Vito Jyoti wants to, we have really rushed him, so I think it's in the fairness things that we allowed him a few more words.
Yeah, a few more words, because then we don't do any justice to Vinay Gidwani's book with these two comments. So that's why I think I should say a few more, spare a few more words. So I start where I started actually. No, I'm not starting again in the same language, but so there is a critique of totalizing accounts of capital in motion in Vinay Gidwani, and it is done in two registers divided in six chapters and one aporia. So there are two organizing devices in this entire book. One is value and another is waste, and he tries to show the structural relation between value and waste. He says that liberalism in India is held together by a problematic of development that deploys illiberal state power to discipline the West, both West land and the wasted mind. So both, you know, and so according to Gidwani, then development emerges as a colonial form of rule or governmentality. The thing is that it is intriguing why Gidwani uses the term development and doesn't refer to the contemporary colonial terms of improvement and progress. By not paying attention to these two terms, improvement and progress, I think he misses a very important point of race and biology that were deployed between 1860s and 1940s to basically disrupt the possibility of development. For example, I missed the work of Crispin Bates, for example. I missed a good reference of Mario Ruten's work as well while flipping through the book. So he in a sweeping comment, he just abolishes the entire mode of production debate that could have come to his understanding as well. So that is where I think he lacks. But then the question of Dipesh Chakraborty's History 1, History 2 follows, and by invoking History 1 and History 2 and by invoking the limits of knowledge that can form in the time of capital, he is critiquing the formulations of Harvey, who, according to him, produces a totalizing, sweeping picture of capital. So his emphasis going along with Dipesh Chakraborty is to go beyond the life process of capital, and that is where I think he is trying to bridge a literature in a division in literature in Marxism. So if you remember, the entire Marxist literature can be divided into two halves. One is the critique of capital from the perspective of labor. We all know that. Another is the critique of labor itself from the capitalist labor itself, right? And critique of capitalist labor itself. So there, I think, Hart and Negri can come in this rubric as well. So there, actually, he draws this distinction between the politics of work and politics of labor, and that is the point where he is trying to say that from the skin and casing of capital, you cannot have a history of labor. That in order to have a history of labor, you have to recognize the use value of labor for labor itself, and for that you need to liberate labor from the frame of capital. So that is what he is trying to do, but I don't think that is adequately established in the field work.
I guess we'll have time to take 2 batches of questions. May I invite the first batch of questions from the audience?
As Stalin said, once the line is determined, workers become decisive. So we do what we have to do. I would discuss, just a few comments on Beyond Kolkata. And I think one of the most significant remarks or intervention that book makes is to link the question of the multitude to that of property relations. And whenever the debate of or the discussion of primitive accumulation comes, I have a question in mind, and I think if the authors get to respond, then they might do it. It's true that primitive accumulation separates labor from the means of production, but it does in a certain property relation, which exists at the contemporary time. I mean, in Marx, the primitive accumulation happened in a certain property relation. What I'm trying to say is that in post-colonial conditions, say for example in India, the immediate problem for the post-independent state was how to give land to the peasants without significantly disturbing the power relations in the villages, while landlessness and everything else was created. So when this accumulation happens, as the book says about the subsistence agriculture or so on and so forth. So what does it say about the primitive accumulation which we are talking about now? That is one. Another point is on the concept of service village. I think that there's another significant thing which the book does. And I just want to point out a few things, is that, say for example, when displacement or demolition in Delhi was happening, one of the central arguments against that was that in these villages or in these slum clusters, the women there are dependent on the colonies which are immediate, the upper middle class colonies on which they are dependent. So there is a kind of remaking and reformation of service villages in there. So I think service village can be used as a conceptual tool as well. And I think Shruti Dubey in her paper was mentioning the case of Noida. And she made the point that Noida was supposed to be an industrial town, a new town. And in fact, it's not even a city name, it's New Okhla Industrial Development Authority. So city and authority is almost, changeable. The last point is, since Professor Das brought the concept of political society, and not brought up but mentioned, is that in political society, it is said that people choose by whom they are governed. The problem is not that. People have to overthrow who govern. And in Beyond Calcutta, I think the direction is given as to how this is to be done. Thank you.
I haven't read the book Beyond Kolkata, but what I do have in mind, and I think maybe it already has the answer, but I heard Professor Das speaking about it, and I think is the construction of Rajarhat very different from the way Salt Lake City was created? Or even if you go back, then the Bokaro is still city, Bhilai is still city, and all these or even Chandigarh for that matter. And then my question is that cities, as we look back in civilization, is there something called organic growth of a city? So like Calcutta, as we know today, or even take the older parts of the city, Calcutta, was it always like this? It wasn't always like this, but still we will not associate the same kind of violence what we associate with a township. I won't call Rajarhat as a city, I would say township. It's a small colony, gated, because unless it's comparable to what Gurgaon is today. Gurgaon was a village known as a small admin unit, and then it became into that big. So it's a city now. This violence, we do not associate with that. So somewhere this creation of new township is reacting to a different kind of a demand. But at the same time, this demand has always been there. As I said, those other cities which were created. But the other, if you look at this kind of a city building or a township building, there is another example. Those who have gone to Islamabad, or those, if you do, I have been to Islamabad, and I have not gone to the Myanmar's new capital, but I have read about it. The way this new capital has been created, and it's completely like, there is no space for the normal people, citizens of that country to go there. It's all for a bureaucrat town, and only diplomats and all, no public transport. You can only travel by your own personal vehicle. And Islamabad is one city like that, where places are far and wide spread over a wide place. And those visions somehow fascinate a lot of us here in India as well. So the new Raipur, which is going to be the new township for the Raipur, replacing the Raipur capital, is precisely imagined on those lines. Chandrababu Naidu now has become the chief minister, and he has said that he will create Andhra Pradesh's new capital, which will be a slum-free capital. And when I was listening to the Rajarhat, I think the one difference I do find is that when these kind of cities are built, then what you do not leave is the cracks and interstices which will allow growth of slums or unauthorized colonies, as it had happened in the case of Noida or in other places. Because these are such compact units that you will not allow such kind of a growth to take place. You will have the people coming and going in. So, and just a small thing, last comment about the resistance, and that why some of these resistance fail. And in my own presentation also I was talking about resistance and the why. And one thing on the resistance is that if you hold on long enough and you keep hitting an idea, then the capital on its own has to shift gears. And one of the examples is that the thermal power plants yesterday I was talking about, since the time this government has come in 60, like not even 100 days, there has been a huge jump into the solar power plants. There have been number of deals which have been signed and all of that. Not only because India is facing a coal import crisis, because there is a big opposition to thermal power plants in many places. So if you hold on long enough, you may not win the full battle, the land will still be gone, but the technological shift, given the climate change and all, they are saying that we need to move to a different, cleaner energy, so that will happen. So the cumulative impact of these struggles may not be visible on their own lives, but it does have a possibility to change the wider logic of things.
Okay, I have a question for Ritojyoti, and okay, let me play the devil's advocate, because it seems actually very interesting, because Gidwani's book is one of the one of the recent books which have been really appreciated worldwide. Even in the Indian academia, Gidwani is considered now a superstar sort of thing. But as you have discussed the book, many loopholes are coming out, and obviously his lack of fieldwork experience, and not the way he framed the questions, there may be some lacuna there as well. But what I'm trying to direct your attention to, that somehow Gidwani's book is a product of a more like a bigger movement sort of thing, which kind of puts the issues of culture and affect before economic concerns, or not before maybe, but somehow surrounded. The economic concerns are surrounded by certain cultural considerations. For example, I'm reminded of Gidwani and Shiv Ramakrishnan's one essay which was published in EPW on migration of the Patels to Ahmedabad, where they, that was again, it was a very simple argument that there are many cultural factors as well working behind a migration decision. Now, this, at the outset, this seems not a very novel argument, but, it has greater implications, in relation to how economic issues are treated in, I'm not going to say today's academia only, in broadly even in public discourses. So, I want your, some views on this connection between the economic and the cultural, which sort of is also producing, because these issues are also coming together in our conference as well. There are some papers which are predominantly economistic maybe, and there are some papers which are, more to the cultural side. So, is there any possibility of bridging these two, tendencies, or a third alternative may come out of this? That's a very, again, speculative question, but.
Imon's point, and would like to have Ritojyoti's. Now, can you reflect on this method of bit of anthropology, bit of economics? I am told he's a geographer. Am I right? So, so with the eminent geographer sitting by your side, now did you, but Ritojyoti, did you find any geography in it? And if you found, how was it placed? Because this is the point that I want to raise. What is the economic argument that we are bringing out by these kinds of, let me be blunt, very low quality anthropological work? I can pick on chapters, styles and all that, but I really want to point, the attention of the readers of the book. What is the method of analysis that is being adopted here? What is the scale, the ease at which the author moves from, from Marx to the Patidars of, So on the method, because the point that I'm trying to raise is there, you see, if the question is that capital interrupts and capital interrupts in a certain way, then it resumes, then do we find any kind of understanding of the logic in which capital, that can explain why capital interrupts, and then if it resumes, how it resumes, or how it therefore conquers new areas, new territories, etc. And can, anthropology in that sense substitute political economy?
A geographer, doing all this, and certainly, as I said, I just skimmed through the book. I didn't read it as thoroughly as I read Professor Somadar's book. One of the reasons being this diversity of content, it's just moving from, I think some of you mentioned it, I mean, he must be very intelligent, but it's a whole body of diverse literature, from classical Marx to Foucault to what have you. It's really diverse, and I thought, I didn't know anything about him, frankly. I thought he was an anthropologist. And later on, I did a Google on him, and then I found out he's a geographer. So the methodology does not lend itself to traditional geography by any means, and the diversity of his interests is such that it is quite confounding at times, because it's like, I don't know, I would find it difficult to be a master of so many trades, so to speak, So, but surely he's, if you look at the notes, there's vast notes, he's read a lot, but certainly if this is geography, then I don't know anything about it. It's a new kind of work. But again, as I think Professor Shyamodar also pointed out, this is the kind of work that is attracting people in the West, you know, because there's a lot of drama. It's like text is drama, you know, like the first page is empty and it's written intentionally empty. I've left this page intentionally empty. I think he has 2-3 of those pages in the book. You know, so it's a very dramatic presentation of text, and you know, and we are all simpletons of the old school, you know, we just write. So it's very attractive, I suppose, to new people who want to, you know, break through in a new way, and so that's my comment. But I can't talk about the substance and the questions Professor Shyamodar asked, because as I said, I just read 2 or 3 chapters, and they were interesting, like development, how development is called a machine. You know, that was also very interesting, and I'd never seen that analogy between development and a machine. So there are all sorts of new things, but definitely this is not what geographers traditionally do. Now, another question I think was raised in the audience by someone about cities in the past. Were they created in violence? Is Rajarhat and new towns an exception? But the truth is that we don't have a lot of records for the old cities, but we know that, for instance, in Kolkata, when the British came and there were the 3 villages, there was a lot of dispossession and displacement of the villages of Kolkata, and they in fact went and they settled south of Govindpur. So urban expansion has always necessitated change of land use and change of livelihood. And perhaps when urbanization occurs slowly and it's of a small scale, it need not be violent like in the past when you were trying to increase your house. You told your neighbors, you know, I'm going to add another story, I hope you don't mind, hope it won't matter. That kind of negotiations did take place. But as the sizes of cities have grown, it's not been possible to, you know, negotiate with those already living there regarding expansion. And possibly land use change has often necessitated the use of maybe not physical force, but some economic incentives, some coercion. So that would be, I think, fairly consistent in the case of most cities. Of course, we don't have full records of that. And then there was the question about the service centers. You know, I was also, in fact, Professor Shyamodar, going to ask you about it, because in the older, you know, that we've had so many new towns, starting from 1948, so many new towns. And generally the policy has been to leave the villages as they are. That's very common. I know that in Navi Mumbai, there were 53 villages which were left intact, and they're called Gauthans, you know, and they were left in the middle of the, Navi Mumbai was huge compared to Rajarhat. Navi Mumbai was, if this is about 3,000 hectares, Navi Mumbai was about 35,000 hectares. So it's a giant compared to Rajarhat, and all the villages were left as is. Only the lands of the villagers was taken. But interestingly, over time, most of these villages, in the first 10 years, they were neglected, but over time, there's been a lot of transformation of these villages, and their land uses have also become quite urban. They've also become, you know, not very different from the surrounding urban areas. So they're not physically today really like villages. They're more like little townlets in the middle of the large city. And I was going to ask Professor Shyamodar regarding the service villages of Rajarhat, because you mentioned them, but are they still there as physical entities, or have they merged with the urbanization that is occurring? And was there any separate plan for the development of these areas in terms of provision of basic infrastructure like water and, solid waste management and all that?
Let me try to say a few things, very contentious things maybe. See, there has been a shift in our academic interest. If our academic interest is also a commodity, that in Aporia Vinay Gidwani seems to hint, there has been a shift from crisis to interruption. And I think you raised a very important question yesterday when you said that you have to re-theorize crisis. I think that is the response that is coming from many of us actually in the floor. So there has been a shift from crisis to interruption. This is one. Now, if you see that the question that both of you asked, cultural studies probably, at least outside India, has lost its original current. You can't do pure cultural studies and thrive in academic market anymore. Then comes this thing, you have a bit of ethnography, a bit of history, a bit of political economy, because political economy is also gaining ground. It is regaining ground, not from many of us young scholars and our academic ancestors, but also in the US Ivy League world. If you see the list of few books that have come out in 2000s, Manu Goswami's book, Andrew Sartori's book, etc., those are thriving in the market. You have some logic that political economy, economic history are coming to reclaim their ground. Now, you also have to understand the constraints in which particularly American academia works. The thing is this, you write your first book, the first book becomes a bit ethnographic because you get 18 months to do your field research in the native setup. The second book, and I'm saying this, the second book becomes a theoretical book. Second book becomes a theoretical book precisely because the contact that you built is lost. And then if you were an ethnographer, you tilt towards the theory of ethnography or the ethnography of theory. Both happen. Ethnography of theory also happens. How knowledge circulates, for example. You can Google and see the circulation, navigation of knowledge. So this is another way you do ethnography of theory, ethnography of knowledge practices, etc. I can name hundreds of books in this list. What I'm trying to say is this now. If you look at Indian academia, and so this is the production part of this literature. Now if you see the reception part, because we receive, we consume, right, in the market. So when we receive what we want to receive, right? So by 1980s, there has been a thriving market on difference, right? So you have to talk of difference. You cannot have a global history of capital. You have to have a different history of capital. Many different histories of capital. So if you look into this thing, this is also the time when we shifted from social history. By shifting from social history to something else that I won't mention that way, but by signaling that shift, we also transition from the British hegemony in academia, archival research, grounded in social history tradition, particular version of social history tradition, to Americanized cultural history tradition, right? And the shift from social history to cultural history in France, in Britain, in America have a different history altogether. For example, the fall of welfare state is connected. How social history became official history there, and then how, from a resistance position to official history, and how it was dislodged. But in India, this separation didn't happen this way. So we did a lot of social history along with cultural turn in this. So a kind of mixed plate actually suits our market. And the recent turn, I think the most recent turn, if you see the amount of money that corporate agencies are pouring into their own academic institutions, Shiv Nadar University, Ashoka University, it is clear that in humanities program, in humanities and social sciences program, it is clear that it is not the IISc, ISI pattern of sociology that they want. Sociology that is subservient to science, helping us to understand how science works in society. Sociology, cultural studies, humanities in broadest possible terms have become a very important commodity, and that is the reason why they are finding students paying 5 lakh rupees a year, divided in 2 semesters, to pay for studying history. Impossible to think of in 2 decades ago back. So I think in order to, this is a very important political economic question that you asked. Why is it that this kind of literature thrives? So this is a tentative answer, risking my
I don't think I have much to add to, nor do I think that I have the burden of responding to some of the questions, because the authors are present, so if they feel like they can easily chip in. I think 2 points need to be clarified. One is this, that when I talked about displacement, I actually talked about displacement from livelihoods as well, but doesn't mean that there wasn't any displacement from home, because the book gives us the impression, and I can actually read out sentences which I think are unnecessary, which actually gives us the impression that the actual figure of the number of people who lost their homes is simply anybody's guess. So it cannot be accurate. So displacement in both senses of the term, loss of home as well as loss of livelihood. The second is the more important question. I don't know whether I could get across, but I would seriously request the authors actually to sort of push the question towards it. And thank you, Madhuresh, for having raised it, that I was not saying how to make these struggles and resistance successful. I think that was not my question. My question was very simple, that why is it that the political parties are not interested in representing the cause? The book actually gives us the impression that it's just that they are not interested in taking up the cause. I think that the answer is much more serious. And one tentative answer to this question is that the way, for example, the representational institutions are framed and structured in a country like India, which is quote-unquote democratic in a certain sense, doesn't allow you to raise these questions. And that's the reason why I think that it's a wrongly posed question that the political parties are not raising, are not representing this cause. But I would rather sort of reverse the question, and I would try and find out why is it that this cause actually defies any representation by the established political parties. And your own organization, for example, comes up with a different notion of representation, where representation is not simply sort of aggregating the interest, but actually it's some sort of mutual learning, that you learn from others' experiences and form up an alliance, which is certainly not either a bureaucratic structure or a completely decentralized structure. So you are thinking in terms of a coordinating mechanism. So, and it's not a political party, by the way. So why is it that whether or not the established political parties, including the left political parties, actually are not simply seriously not interested in representing it, precisely because you know that this democratic architecture of institutions doesn't allow these questions to be posed. And we have to understand deeply into, we have literally to delve deeply into the philosophy of the institutional architecture, which actually disallows these questions to come and to be posed in the first place. So if you cannot pose these questions, where do you find the answers? I think that this is the trajectory that this book could have followed and could have actually sort of given us some more insights. And that's why I referred to, at one level I said that, I had 2 points actually. One was that the philosophy of democratic representation as propounded by John Stuart Mill actually talks about a common good or public good perspective. And you know that the public good is the most absent of all things, excepting that laws actually make it, number one, Ashok is here, he will bear me out. Number one, that public good is always indivisible. So anyone raising one's voice is a strict no-no, one. And two, that public good always enjoys some sort of impunity. So you can't actually, you are always likely to be branded as anti-national if you raise these questions. And precisely this is exactly what happens. So this was my first point. And the second is that can we actually theorize the formlessness instead of waiting to organize these struggles and resistance? That was my point. So how can we theorize the fluidity and the permanent state of unorganized nature of these movements now that you have about a couple of decades or more than a couple of decades? But still you know that no political party, no strong organization has come up to take up their cause. And why? It's not a casual lapse on our part, but I just was interested in finding out some sort of structuralist explanation for that. Thank you.
We just don't have time for your reaction, for the author's reaction.
First to Madhuresh, you see, there are cities and cities, towns and towns. But if you think of, for example, Mumford's famous book, City in History. Now, clearly, Mumford there is showing how cities, bypasses, the restructuring of New York and everything takes place in a way which is discontinuous, which didn't happen earlier. So it's not enough to say that there are port cities built around ports. There are railway towns built around the railway towns. There is a Chittaranjan town built around a locomotive factory. There may be, as Madhuresh rightly points out, administrative towns. Think of the Mughal city, the imperial city on which Bernier had written so much. So these are not new. These were there. But the point is that besides what the left front was saying, that this is being meant for residential purpose, you do not have cities only for residential purpose. You have a city in some way or another, either it will serve some kind of production or it will serve pure administrative thing. But to house people, a city is being built, this rarely happens in history. It never happens. It happens only in the government's wishful proclamations, nothing else. The government would not have been so much in a hurry only to, provide homes for NRIs and few people, because this is not such an urgent agenda. So I think somewhere Rajarhat, in terms of combining the various angles of the deployment of new capital in its all shape, whether it's a real estate market, how do you invest certain kinds of capital, how do you have a smart city, which is the latest language, how do you house IT houses, how do you have service villages, how least do you displace people from their land and force them to move away. So in all these cases, Rajarhat became, or they thought that Rajarhat would become a new beginning. And I think service villages in that sense, where it is true that, many of the cities had service villages of certain kind, but the way Rajarhat planners planned this thing was unique. And perhaps some of the service villages are over, in the sense that, you see, Rajarhat comparatively was a prosperous area. I mean, we have tried to show that Titagarh and others in the North 24 Parganas was in fact worst. In the last 20 years, the standard of living in the, the jute mill centers on the bank of the river, their people are much worse off than they were in Rajarhat. So in Rajarhat, it was not a question that there were not electricity lines, they didn't have food. In fact, it was a subsistence agriculture on the whole going well, which they destroyed. So some of these, of course, people are now wondering if they could sell off land at a higher price, because that is the story of the Bhangur Development Authority, which is the BRADA, which has now been, winded up. So I think the service village, in terms of design of what they wanted to do, was an important part, and maybe this is being copied. After writing this book 3 years, how much of that remained, I would not be able to say. But something then again, I think the author should think, this I think to be a challenge. It's a challenge for writing contemporary history. How do you write a history of the contemporary? In other words, you know that you are a journalist. You are only chronicling what is happening now. Yet the challenge is that what are the points that you want to tease out and you think they would have implications for a history that the present moment would create. So we are writing a history of the present, yet it is a history that will be created. Not only the present which would be situated. That is where I would, if you permit me, I would beg to differ. I think the challenge in writing the politics of Rajarhat is not how do we deal representation. In fact, if you ask me, I would say if we have, banished that whole thing altogether, I do not know whether the two co-authors would agree, but I always tend to extreme views, as you know. On spur of moment, I think we have done good. And we should not bring back Mill anymore. If we have forgotten it, good. In fact, the ghost of Mill should have been over long back. The challenge is, what you call as formlessness is actually a form. So what you look at as an anomaly in the new type of politics that is gaining there, where it is important that, that chapter begins with the new party comes to power. And see what has happened after the new party has come to power. In large cases, farmers have been allowed to till. Completely illegally. Nobody is taking away land because the fear is that they will be thrown out of elections. It has been preceded, as we recorded, large-scale murders. On the other hand, look what is coming up in Rajarhat. Unanticipated, unexpected, completely new things, including Tagore Cultural Center, eco parks and whatnot. Much more than the Newtown dreamers under the previous left-front government could think of in terms of ecology. But probably they will bring back all the birds and the trees and everything if it is humanly possible. So I think that is where the interest is, that how is this what usually you would have called an anomaly. This is an anomalous universe. So it's not a question of formless, because the form that we are thinking is a form which is over. No point in dissecting the form. What is interesting is that along with political parties, different types of organizations, and these kinds of motley groups of people, how do they combine into making what, partly borrowing from Negri, we use the word multitude. What is the shape of the new politics that is coming up? And it's not that the representational game is out, but the representational game by the old route is certainly out. So it's not formlessness. That is what I'm saying. It is the new form of urban politics that needs to be studied much more, because in towns like this, the old kind of citizens' assembly, procession and all that, they will be there, but one needs to study much more the kind of new networks that are now taking place, the new forms of protest that are taking. That is the new form. And it will not have a standardized assembly-like form anymore. So if Mill is out, you and I will celebrate in the evening.
We have already eaten into the tea time, so we'll break for tea and carry over the discussion.